So in the management literature, there is a sort of evolving literature that is popping up. This idea that luck and randomness actually plays an important role to everyday life, particularly within organizations. So people like Christopher Bosch, I believe, at NYU, has a sort of a book about serendipity. Chenwei Liu and Yerker Denrell. These are sort of friends of mine. Those are colleagues of mine, and they are doing work on sort of luck and the sort of emerging idea of luck. But you know, um, what it sort of looks like within this literature is a little bit abstract, right? The sort of idea that there is an error component to everything that we actually do, and the error component actually matters. And the way that we statistically can control for luck is to look at this error component or look at sort of best case scenarios and kind of use what is called sort of a Bayesian way of thinking. You use um, what your priors were in the past or priors in another area, and then you update your prediction, your sort of posterior, based on these priors and the available information that's there. So you develop these posterior um, sort of beliefs on what is actually going on right now based on the idea that there's what you understood in another area or what you understood in the past, and sort of available information. Now, what's interesting with this is that this literature is very abstract and it doesn't give you a sense of what to do and how to sort of manage this. Um, so, part of the reason why I actually talk about being a bumbling idiot, right? If you think about what I'm actually going into, this is a bumbling idiot theory of entrepreneurship, and it's really about the idea that we have to have some humbleness, in that the environment and what we are in actually plays a really important role in terms of what happens with our own individual outcomes and even with our actions, right? What we actually choose is often very much because of the environment and what has happened in the environment. It's strongly shaped by where we actually are and what ends up happening. Now, this idea is fairly well known, um, sort of called the Matthew effect in the scientific literature, where the idea that the rich get rich and the poor get poorer, and it's really thinking about how influential is um, the environment with the outcomes that we actually get. And the story is that the sort of the academic literature suggests that the environment actually plays a pretty significant role. And that might change from environment to environment or context to context, how much the outside world actually plays with the outcomes that you actually get. But you have to be quite aware that when you do something, the results of what you actually get might not necessarily be because of the actions that you chose. Um, and it might not necessarily be because of you, it might be because of other people. And the actions that you choose may not be because of your own agency, right? This idea that we sort of control our future and all of our actions and what we do. Um, there is a lot that goes on, right? I just want you to sort of think about uh, your what you do on a daily basis. Why do you actually do the things that you actually do? Why do you brush your teeth? For example, you might think that that is your own agency, but actually it's guided by scientific institutions that have sort of investigated that teeth brushing is good. It's, gui- it's guided by the advertising agencies that are selling you toothpaste and toothbrush. It's guided by the manufacturers that are actually selling or producing these toothbrushes like Johnson and Johnson. It is guided by federal and state or province institutions, government institutions that try to encourage you to do to do the activity. It's guided by schools and education systems. So if you think about all of the things, all of the sort of systems that encourage you to do a certain behavior, you actually don't have a tremendous amount of agency. And if you believe that at least some of what occurs within institutions is somewhat not random, right? So we know actually this is Meyer and Rowan has this really good paper from many years ago in the late 1970s. It was 77, 78, something like around there. And the idea is that there are rules and institutions that become institutionalized that may not necessarily be completely rational. And there's a whole literature, actually, it's sort of the institutional literature, where people adopt different technologies, different practices, because that they are simply because other people have adopted them before. And if we believe that other people adopt things because that there is sort of a mass audience, where we get things like a bandwagon effect, which has been discussed in the literature. We get things like contagion, where information spreads relatively rapidly. We get things where a whole, group of people are sort of performing a certain activity with, that with sort of some chance that is built into that. Now, another thing that's important to realize is in any given day, there are random things, genuine random things that happen to you. And in technology studies, if we look at sort of evolution of path dependency, what's called path dependency, this idea is things evolve based on what has happened in the past, sort of history of the past. There's a well-known study about the QWERTY keyboard by David, is his last name. And the idea is that the QWERTY keyboard, QWERTY, is not the most optimal keyboard that we know that is used. And so a couple of years ago, TikTok was sort of a thing that was emerging, and I saw somebody on TikTok that was typing with this really peculiar keyboard that was actually three-dimensional, and you just simply had to move the keys in different directions. It was like, maybe the keys were moving. Each key, there was maybe like 10 keys all together, and you just move them in a different direction. This particular individual was typing spectacularly fast. I've never seen anything like that. And yet, why doesn't everybody adopt that? It's because it's hard to actually adopt, and we sort of have a history of using the QWERTY keyboard. My kids this summer, I'm hopefully going to encourage them to learn typing, and of course, it's going to be on the QWERTY keyboard. There's more efficient keyboards that exist, and the reason why the QWERTY keyboard actually was created was because it was invented by the typewriter company, and it allowed them to type the word typewriter faster than any other word. And so it's not necessarily an efficient keyboard, it's not the best, but because of things have happened in the past, we have this path dependency that evolves over time. And so there are random lucky things that do happen in the marketplace, and they do have sort of persistent effects. We are pretty well aware of the sort of persistent effects that happen over time. So, what is it? What can I actually do? And then the other thing is, there's just randomness, right? Like one day, there will be some tragic, maybe it's some tragic event, maybe it is, some sort of beautiful event that happens, but that event occurs, and all of a sudden changes everything. We had COVID-19. We had the 2008 financial crisis. We had, you know, the we had the 1974 OPEC oil crisis. That is largely out of our control. Um, so it's pretty lucky in the sense that it's a random thing that happens to you that you know, that is relatively random for you. Now there are reasons for why that happens at the institution level, but you have no control over those institutions, or very little control of those institutions. So you have to just chalk it up to, this is a random sort of external, what's called exogenous, an external thing that happened to us, right? Just kind of like changed who we were. All of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, what the heck? Um, so those things happen. And now, what can you do as an entrepreneur, given that there's all this luck, there's all this sort of just random, just weird crap that happens? You can set yourself up by creating somewhat like real options, right? So, what is a real option? This is the option. It's a contract basically, where it's the option to do an action in the future, a strategic action in the future that that allows you to, you know, doesn't it's the right but not the obligation to do a strategic action in the future. So um, it's not necessarily that you have to do something. It's that you get that option to do it. And so that's why I'm actually a really big fan of this sort of bumbling along, the idiot sort of story of entrepreneurship, where you are just bumbling along, you don't know what is the right thing. That's the other thing I want to sort of point out before I get to the real option thing. Now, the idea with the sort of randomness, and a tremendous amount of uncertainty and not knowing when this randomness will happen, is that you don't know what the right course of action actually is. We never know what the right course of action is. You talk to an entrepreneur, they're like, I don't know. Like, I haven't got a clue what the right thing to do is. And even when you perform that particular action, you don't know what that right course of action, if you don't even know what the effects of that course of action is, right? We sort of think that we can measure the outcomes from your particular actions, but because there's all this randomness and all this weird stuff that's happening that's outside of our control, you cannot measure any of the effects of your actions very easily. It is very difficult to measure those things, and you have to have a giant infrastructure to sort of do measurement. But even still, you know, that giant infrastructure is terrible, and we know that it's very terrible, right? Like, we're well aware. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're in this sort of environment where you can't spend any time monitoring to see what the success of what you're trying to do is. And so you just simply have to go with what something happens and sort of adapt when something kind of happens, right? And you just kind of go with the flow. And that's where I was coming back to this idea of the real option sort of strategy is to plant small little things, right? Do small little entrepreneurial things, small little innovative things that are just kind of like seeds in the ground, right? And I know, you know, there's some scientific literature by Leventhal and Adner that is not necessarily, you know, a real options approach to do this, but it's a good sort of infrastructure to talk about it. Where you just plant little seeds in the ground and you wait to see what actually happens. And these little seeds, you're not paying the full cost, right? But you're seeing what actually happens, how the environment changes, what is it that you're doing. And the only way that you can have a jump on somebody else, right, is to make that slight, small investment. And this sort of real options approach is very similar to learning, right? The idea of learning, and this is the you know, one of my colleagues, you know, Michael Leiblein, has sort of a couple of papers on this idea. In Harposen, I have a couple of papers on this. I think it's Harposen, and the idea is that you use sort of these options as learning, right? And so the idea is, you wouldn't to go back to the story of Steve Jobs, he took a calligraphy course when he was younger, and that seems like the stupidest course, right? To take a calligraphy course, completely non-rational, doesn't make any sense. There's no value to that. But then when it came to creating the Macintosh computer, when he eventually created the Macintosh computer 20 years later, that calligraphy course was one of the defining features because it became fonts in the platform that didn't exist. Nobody had fonts before, different fonts, and people loved it. It was a defining feature of the actual, um, computer itself, and it was a selling feature. People loved that particular thing. So all of these things, right? And that's where, learning is such a difficult thing to disentangle. It's like life is a difficult thing to disentangle. In general, the things that you did 20 years ago might pop up and sort of become part of what you're actually doing. And you would never know that that was an important thing in your life. You're doing that sort of weird little goofy thing early on. And then you're 20 years later, you're like, I remember doing this thing. Why didn't I actually do this thing? Why didn't I add this thing into it? And so if you didn't have that infrastructure, right, both within the knowledge acquisition and having the technological assets, right? So that's why I'm a big believer in this idea of sort of wasting some resources to build technological assets, is because you never know where it's actually going to take you. And yes, it is costly to do learning, it's costly to build technological assets, but the idea is to not bankrupt yourself as you're sort of evolving and thinking about it, right? So thinking about what can you waste, what can you pursue, right? So doing all the fun things that you would love to do is actually a good thing. Like choosing where are the fun things, what are all the activities I could do, because someday it might be something that's actually important to aid you, to give you that jump up. And the only way, the only possibility, and there's literature on absorptive capacity with Dan Leventhal, and I believe it's Michael Cohen, or Wes Cohen. So the idea with absorptive capacity is the capacity to basically learn new things and absorb new things. Without that, actually investing in something at the get-go, right? Without doing that, it's hard to learn new things. It's hard to absorb information and knowledge because you don't have those particular skill sets, right? So you need the infrastructure. You need, even though it's wasteful, even though it's costly, you need that infrastructure to build on top of it, to do more, to have kind of like a scaffolding that you can build stuff on top continuously, for a relatively long period of time. And so thinking about yourself in entrepreneurial ventures as a bumbling idiot, you don't know. There's no way that you could ever know the things that you're doing are right. You never know if it's going to be the right thing in the future. You never know whether the things that you did in the past actually make a difference today. You never know what is actually going on. This idea of assigning, and I love this sort of idea behind it, is assigning sort of actions and outcomes. It's called credit assignment. And Christina Fang has a really nice paper on credit assignment. And the idea is we just don't necessarily know how to align our actions to outcomes. And it's next to impossible to sort of match and have put the credit from what you did in the past, to what is happening today, because there's so many things that have happened, right? And so the goal is, because we don't know any of that, we don't have any of that information, we'll never have that information, is to be a bumbling idiot, to be modest with what you're doing, to know that you don't know what the right things are, to know that you're just really bumbling along. You're really kind of uncertain about what's actually going on, and you're bumbling through things. You're kind of just like, I don't know. I think this is the right thing to do, but my chance of the idea is, I think it's 51% chance that this is a positive thing to do. but then 49% is not a good thing to do, right? Like you maybe have a slight advantage, but probably not. Um, and so you just bumble along and you sort of see where you're going to go with what you're doing, and use the scaffolding in the future to help you out, continuously building on that scaffolding, continuously actually doing things that you like. And so what's guiding there is the idea of gumption, right? What's guiding with this sort of bumbling idiot story is you need that gumption. You need to have that sort of the ability to get up and get going and keep trying repeatedly, but then have that sort of long-term vision of where you're going, so you can guide that scaffolding, so it can build over time, so you can actually do something that didn't exist before, and you don't know what it's going to be, right? Like you could sort of presume that you're going to have this 10-year plan, but yeah, you know what, 10-year plans, yeah, I don't know, right? Like the idea of sort of making business plans and stuff are out the window, because you never know. You can do that maybe within the oil and gas industry, where you have large infrastructure and it's well laid out, but even still, those sort of financial plans for the future are not that great, right? We know that things change rapidly. COVID-19 happens, right? Weird events happen all the time, and those financial plans are not necessarily all that important for us in the long run, right? And I want you to ask a real organization that abides by those financial plans very strongly. You're not going to find a lot that actually do that on their day-to-day. So what we end up doing is we're bumbling idiots, guided by some form of gumption. And, as you pursue these things, as you sort of see where you're going, you have to be a bumbling idiot, because you'll never know what is the possible course of action that's actually right. But what you're doing is you're laying down kind of stupid investments that are a waste of money, a waste of resources, repeatedly towards a direction, until you find that option, until something comes up that actually will change the course of what you're actually doing. So you could go a long time, right? Like for almost an indefinite a period of time, where nothing happens. That there's negative returns, right? There's a whole bunch of negativity, a whole bunch of bad news, and all of a sudden something changes, and changes what you're doing, and turns the course of what you're actually doing, if you're paying attention and you sort of see that this is changing in the environment.
One of the things I think about is with opportunities is that opportunities don't necessarily present themselves in the way that people think about. It's often the result of non-events, or not realizing that there's something that's actually going on that you never see. It never sort of presents itself, and it's very unclear what that looks like. And the reason is that there is a lot of luck in randomness that actually happens. So what am I actually talking about here? The idea is, if you don't do something, right? So imagine a course of action where you actually do something and you execute on it, and somebody sort of finds that particular thing, and they sort of jump on that particular thing, and then you have an opportunity that is formed from that, right? So maybe you create some new product, and the product doesn't necessarily have a use at this moment, but then, somebody finds this thing, and then they jump on that particular thing. Now, if you don't choose that particular course of action, and you don't do that, then you would never know what that actually looks like, and whether that opportunity actually gets formed or not, right? And so you're always locked out of that particular potential. Take advantage of that uncertainty, or, just lucky moment in history, right? And the only way that you can create those moments where there's something weird or unusual that happens is to actually act. I used to think that inaction may be even better than action, but I've actually changed my mind on that. And the reason is because of this inability to see other opportunities form behind the scenes. So, to give you a concrete example of this, I am fairly active on social media, as you probably have seen me to some degree. You could probably find me all over the place on social media once you start looking. And the idea is, it's not necessarily that people sort of gravitate towards that, or that there's some sort of significant event that happens, but it's in that lucky scenario where somebody is searching for something and they can't find it, and then they stumble across something that you said at one point many years ago that resonates with them, and that gives them the warm fuzzies, that gives them the feeling that there's something positive. And then by chance, for whatever reason, there's something that they're thinking about in their life that they think, oh, I wonder if this particular individual knows something about that. And then they might reach out or, give some extra opportunities that wouldn't have existed in the first place for you. And I kind of strongly believe that this actually happens a fair bit. It's just that you can't see that happening. You can never discover the sort of effects of that. And it's very challenging to put your finger on what it is that's actually happening. And I don't think you can ever measure that. There's this scholar at UC Santa Barbara, and I am totally blanking on his name. He's actually a really good scholar. Sort of studies the effects of social media. And some of his sort of thoughts are the fact of this: you don't know how useful this stuff is until somebody actually needs it. And that's kind of like knowledge development, right? You don't know if it's actually useful. You don't know if anybody will ever need it, right? I often think about scientific understanding in that way, where you create an idea and it might not necessarily be that useful at this given moment, but 40, 50, 100 years goes by, and then somebody discovers this particular idea, which actually happens for a bit, and then people sort of realizing that this was actually an insightful idea, and we should bring this in. And all of a sudden, after 50 years of basically being in non-existence, that idea props up again, and it becomes part of the zeitgeist. And I often think about the ideas of sort of luck and randomness happening in that way. I don't think we necessarily have luck in the sense of, that it's truly randomness that happens. I think we're all in somewhat of a complicated, complex system where we're all interacting with each other, and it sort of evolves over time. But eventually, because it's an interacting system where you have, so complexity is the idea where you have multiple nodes, and these nodes interact in various different ways. And it eventually, as these nodes are sort of changing and interacting, you stumble into a configuration that actually sort of fits or benefits you in some sort of way. And the only way that you can identify that particular configuration is if you're actually acting and doing something in the environment, and creating those moments for chance opportunities to occur, for lucky things to occur, for something to actually work. So, there is a lot of, if you take a step back from all this, right? So what does that actually mean? Gumption is going to matter. a tremendous amount, right? Because what ends up happening is, as you get gumption, you kind of have a bit of blind faith that something is going to happen. You actually have to have a lot of blind faith that something is going to happen that is positive, and you just keep working at it going forward. There's the idea that, firms pursue profit is a little bit of a strange idea, because that is a lagging indicator. In fact, what ends up happening is that you pursue some sort of innocuous, weird thing that's part of gumption, that you're pursuing, that problem that you're pursuing, that matters, where people are struggling with it, and you pursue that thing and sort of solving those problems, and then eventually the profits actually come back. So it's not necessarily, it's very much a lagging indicator. It's not the sort of profit maximizing firm that we think about, but it's a lagging indicator that the firm is actually doing something well. Now, why is that sort of being pursued that way? I think it's simply because we can't measure this sort of soft things, the solving struggling problems, and the gumption that people actually have and do. So, the other thing that you have to realize, because it's sort of this complex system that's interacting, is that there's often not really any right or wrong answers that happen. There's not really a good outcome that you can definitively say that this is a better outcome than that. Because it might be just simply the fact that it hasn't occurred at this moment. The negative outcomes continue to happen. You don't necessarily have that positive outcome just yet. And that's hard to sort of grasp and understand, that because of the complex system that's sort of evolving over time, that's interconnecting, that's changing, that's continuously sort of morphing all the time, that sometimes something that might actually be a negative might turn into a positive. And it's just very difficult to understand what those particular things are. And that's why, I come back to this idea of sort of an idiot's theory to creating something from nothing. I don't think we can definitively ever say that there's a right path. And I think if you're actually doing it and you're in the moment of doing something, every single innovator, entrepreneur, every single creator, every single decision maker will say that they actually really didn't know what the right answer was. They kind of bumbled their way into it. They kind of went through this moment of, what the hell? I'm just going to do this thing. I'm just going to say, Bob's your uncle, I'm just going to go and pursue this thing regardless of what these particular outcomes are. I spent enough time analyzing the situation. This is likely going to be wrong, and you're going to have poor outcomes, but there might be a chance that there might be a positive outcome from this particular thing. And so you could see with this sort of belief, it's not even really experimentation. It's not really, it's not in the sense of sort of just trying things, but it's in the sense of you're just bumbling along. You're doing your best that you can possibly do. You sort of grasp at straws when you need to. You kind of don't know ever what the right answers are. And so, why is it that experimentation, there's the experimentation of just trying something sort of idea and seeing what happens. I think that is an interesting conception, but then there's also the experimentation, the sort of scientific experimentation where you systematically try something, you try to acquire knowledge through using the scientific method. Now, the problem with that is that even if you did everything right, with using the scientific method, it's all very rigorous, you're still going to have what are called internal threats and external threats to validity. And so what are those? That is just plausible explanations that the thing that you're working on is not necessarily, or the results that you get are not necessarily because of the mechanism that you propose, and it's not necessarily going to be generalizable outside of that simple context that you're actually looking at. So at best that you can do is just play around with things, just see what happens. You're a complete sort of idiot, that you don't know what are the possible courses of actions, but you just try and you see. You play with things, you try to make it interesting. And so I think by doing that, it changes the discussion from feeling that there's a right way, that there's value, that everything has to be sort of set up in a very rational way, to a very irrational, very playful, very just explorative way where you're just kind of wandering around and seeing what actually happens. Because there's not really a right course of action with anything that you do. There's somewhat better courses of actions, but we never know if that's a somewhat better course of action until often much later on. And so there's just ways that you can play, explore, find things that are interesting, find things that are meaningful to you, and pursue those things, because you never have what it's supposed to be, and you never really have a clear sense of what are the alternatives, what's the decision criteria, all these things that you need to make a rational or even boundedly rational decision. You kind of just bumble through it. And sometimes you're going to make mistakes, and sometimes you're going to do okay. And you just hope that the thing that you're doing is going to pan out in the long run.